Alright guys, so today I'm going to talk about how to develop a useless superpower in a foreign language and how, at least if your goal is to sound smart in spoken contexts, you can avoid a lot of the written language, right? And what I mean by useless superpower, well, here's the thing. So I learned Japanese to an extremely high literary level, or I'm able to basically read light novels in Japanese. And the thing is, guys, is that to be able to read these light novels, right, you have to learn a ton of words, right? And words that don't actually overlap with academic texts. So even if I wanted to read a research paper in Japanese, a lot of the words that are going to be used in here are not going to overlap with academic research. Do you guys understand? So so that's the thing. Because the thing with light novels and anime is that there's a lot of literary words in here. If I had to like have a guess, there's roughly 10,000 literary words you have to know, specifically if you want to be able to understand all genres of light novels. And that does not count like all the genre specific words you gotta know for each domain. So for fantasy, you gotta know a bunch of fantasy words. For sci-fi, anime, and light novels, you gotta learn a bunch of sci-fi. For military vocabulary, you gotta learn a bunch of military vocabulary. For slice of life, modern, monogatari type series, like you gotta learn a bunch of those vocabulary. So what I'm saying is that there's a ton of useless words per se that are used in anime that don't overlap in real life or even in academic contexts. So unless you're an extreme fan of anime and light novels and literature, like let's say you're just such a fan of French literature, right? Like you want to be able to read all the French classics and everything, then yes, it's probably worth it to learn all those useless words, those literary words that are not going to overlap with academic research papers. But the reason why I'm saying this is because unless you have a joy of being able to consume classical literature and language, then there is no point in learning all those little useless literary words, right, to sound smart, because a lot of those words are not going to be used in academic literature. Now here's the thing, there's still a lot of formal vocabulary that you learn through reading books that do overlap with academic research, academic papers and stuff, right? In academic fields. There are still some words that do overlap. I'm not going to deny that. But you have to keep in mind that when you're consuming, light novels, there's just a lot of words that are just pretty much useless, right? A lot of words that you're not going to see outside of something like anime or something outside of, fantasy light novels, right? So that's the thing you have to keep in mind when it comes to language. And the reason why I'm able to understand this is because I know 3 languages. So I understand the nuances of different domains and how much of those vocabulary overlap with different domains. And at least for Japanese, you gotta learn, there's probably, dude, I'm gonna guess, bro. Dude. There's probably 5,000 formal words that overlap with academic literature. But the rest of the 15,000 words you have to learn in order to understand all genres of anime and light novels, I can probably say dangen dekiru is probably just completely useless. It's useless, which means that those extra 15,000 words that I know from reading all these hard light novels are completely useless in the context of even academic research and academic papers. Even are useless. Now, maybe the political vocabulary I learned from anime might not be useless, actually. So maybe it might bump up to 7,000 words. Because if you want to read a political essay, you gotta learn political vocabulary. But there's a lot of anime sometimes that use those vocabularies, so you end up learning that. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of words that are used in anime, in literature, and fiction that are just completely useless, right? And that you don't need to learn these words, So even if you want to sound like a sophisticated native speaker of a certain language, you don't have to learn those words. You don't have to waste your time, learning all those words that are not going to even help you understand academic research. Because a lot of these words that are used in anime are only used in anime and fiction. This applies to any language. if I'm going to learn, if I were to basically master all of classical literature, classical Arabic, for example, if I were to take Arabic, for example, yes, there's going to be some formal words that are going to overlap with MSA for me to read like a scientific paper in Arabic. But I bet you, bro, there's a lot of classical Arabic words in the Quran or in Thousand Arabian Nights, right? In classical Arabic fiction, there's a lot of words, literary words in there that are probably never ever going to get used in MSA, and even like an academic paper in Arabic. It's not going to overlap. And same with French. I know this with French, guys. There's a lot of words used in classical French literature that don't overlap with academic papers in French. So I realized that like when it comes to language, there's like 3 different registers, right? Domains of language per se. And some of them overlap with each other and some of them don't. For example, there's conversational language. So conversational casual language is basically the domain where there's a bunch of slang, it's a bunch of informal words, right? A bunch of, casual expressions. This is the language you use on the streets. This is the everyday language that people use when they communicate with each other, right? Like on the streets or like in household. So this is the conversational language domain. And then you have a formal academic register of language. So basically this type of register in language it contains grammar patterns, grammar structures, and vocab specifically for formal contexts, right? So if you're basically wanting to read like a nonfiction, if you want to read like a nonfiction article or a nonfiction book, then you'll be learning formal vocabulary. And then you have the last register domain of language, which is the literary language, right? And typically with the literary language, in terms of vocab, it has the most amount of vocab and words, because there is no end to how much people make up literary words. Like, people just end up even making new words in Japanese today, for literary light novels and anime. Like that's what makes it so annoying. It's like, so at least with so there's like a certain register of literary language, like even like grammar, like the grammatical syntax of some literary like poetic prose is like different than what they would use in an academic setting, even. Because the academic grammar patterns and vocabulary are used just to convey information. Whereas the literary, like the type of language they use here, the literary poetic prose they use in here, it's a very artistic, beautiful way of expressing an emotion or like an idea, right? And in the conversational, casual domain of language is basically just used to like, express very simple ideas like, what are you doing tomorrow? Or like, did you do that? Or like, it's like, or like, oh, it's like, it's like very simple concepts that like everyday concepts people use. So typically the easiest domain to master for any language is the casual domain, the casual conversational domain. Then after that would be probably like, formal academic domain would be harder after that. And then the hardest domain to master would be the literary domain. Because with this type of domain, it's like the syntax, the grammar, the words they use. You just gotta learn a ton of freaking words. Like, at least for Japanese, like I know for a fact that you gotta learn like another 10,000 literary words, bro. I'm telling you guys, I'm speaking through experience. Another 10,000 literary words you gotta know, right? That explain emotion, that explain very poetic type of phrasing. You gotta learn that many words, bro. And by the way, those 10,000 words don't overlap with academic research in Japan. I'm just saying. So that's how you can develop a useless superpower in a sense, is by memorizing all these literary words, right? Because this literary domain is very specific to literature, right? Fiction literature, right? Specifically, right? Because nonfiction books don't use literary prose. They use academic formal register of language. So it's a different register of language in a different domain. And they use different grammatical sentence structures too. So, but some of these do overlap. So for example, if you're to consume a literary light novel, you have a combination of conversational language that overlaps into mainly literary language that also overlaps a little bit into formal. So if you were to read a light novel, right, 50% of the light novel is conversational because it still contains character dialogues. But for example, maybe like, and then after that, you would have maybe like 30% of the book is literary, and maybe another 20% is formal. So if I were to divide the ratios, it's not the most accurate ratio, but if I were to divide the ratios of this light novel specifically for ReZero, it'll be 50% conversational, 30% literary, and 20% formal, academic. So you're still learning academic language, but it just makes up a very small portion of the light novel when you're reading it. So the thing with me is like, I know how to read academic papers, but for me sometimes it's like it's a lot more rare, mainly because the formal academic structures of language is not really widely used in anime, right? It is still used in higher level anime, but it's not as widely used as like, if you're to read like a political essay, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind, but it does sort of prepare you for that, because with anime, they mainly flourish off of conversational and literary language, right? So they use a lot of conversational language, slang, combined with literary poetic prose, right? Basically Shakespeare way of speaking, in anime and light novels. So basically, like, that's why, like, if you want to really truly understand language, you have to really understand these three main domains: conversational, literary, and formal academic domains of language. And each of these domains have different vocabulary, different sentence structures of grammar, different vocab. So you guys have to be very specific. So, if you just have very little interest in literature in that language, then you can just stick to conversational or formal academic content, right? So if you're to basically consume a political essay, an historical essay, like a historical text, it's mainly going to be primarily be written in like all formal academic register of language. It's probably going to contain very little casual conversational language because there's not going to be any dialogue. It's just going to be explaining facts. So if you were to pick up like a nonfiction book, it's mainly going to have all of it be like academic type of language, right? And grammar patterns, vocabulary, right? So yeah, guys, just mainly understand these things. And if you want to develop the use of superpower, you can. Like, I mean, just it's kind of cool. It's like, yeah, you know all these words native speakers don't know, but it's like, it's only useful for understanding literature. And it's like, unless you want to understand that, it's like, there's no point in it practically. But it is kind of cool to be like, yeah, I know this word. Like, it's funny because I went to Japan like 3 years ago, and I was like, I showed a bunch of words I knew to like a Japanese native speaker of mine in Japan, like to one of my cousins, and they were like, they didn't even know the word. They're like, sugoi. I'm like, it's funny though. It's funny, like, but it's like, of course, it's like a use of superpower, because like it's like a power where like you can impress native speakers because you know a rare word they don't know, but it's like it's kind of useless because it's like it's only used in this context in like literature, so it's like kind of useless, but it's kind of funny at the same time. So if you guys learn languages, like be very selective with what domain you want to master, because you can avoid the hurdle of learning a bunch of useless words. So that you can at least like improve the language that you actually want to master, whether it be like conversational or like academic. So yeah, guys, but that's it for today.